The neighbor saw me, and I couldn't pretend anymore. Before I ever crossed the line, I stood in the middle of my kitchen asking myself a question that had been echoing in the back of my mind for years. When did I stop being seen? My name is Clara. I'm 38 years old, a mother of two, and married to a man I once thought I'd never fall out of love with. Daniel and I were that couple in college, the kind people whispered about with envy. He was sharp, confident, ambitious. I was steady, nurturing, a quiet dreamer. It worked. For a long time it worked. But love isn't just about what was. It's about what continues to be. Somewhere between bedtime routines, mortgage payments, and Daniel's endless meetings, I disappeared. At first I thought it was temporary, something all couples go through, but then the silence between us stopped being a pause and became the norm. I could go days without hearing anything deeper than, "Did you pay the gas bill?" And then Aiden moved back in next door. He was the kid from 2 doors down, the one I used to give popsicles to when he scraped his knee. Now he was 23, tall, tan, and carrying the kind of quiet strength that made people lean in when he spoke. I told myself it was nothing, that he was just being neighborly. But when he crouched beside me in the backyard to fix a broken sprinkler I'd given up on, and his fingers brushed against mine, I felt something spark inside me. Something I hadn't felt in years. I should have stopped it then. I should have ignored the way his compliments stayed with me longer than they should. I should have said no when he brought over books he thought I'd like, or asked me to read his grad school essay. But I didn't. Because for the first time in a long time, I felt noticed. Not as a mom, not as a wife, but as a woman. This isn't a story about seduction. It's a story about attention. About what happens when someone finally sees you after years of being invisible. And it's the story of how one late afternoon conversation on a porch changed the course of my marriage and my life forever. I never saw it coming. Not really. Not in the way people imagine these things, where a woman is seduced by a stranger or swept away in a reckless affair. That wasn't me. That wasn't this. What happened between me and Aiden wasn't planned. It was slower, quieter. The kind of thing that creeps in while you're folding laundry and wondering if anyone notices how tired you are. It began with the sprinkler. Aiden had been back in the neighborhood for about a month when it broke. Daniel was on another trip, Chicago or Boston, I can't remember, and I'd spent 20 minutes wrestling with the damn thing before Aiden spotted me from his porch. Need help? I almost said no. I should have. But instead, I shrugged. If you don't mind. He crossed the yard in seconds, crouched beside me in the grass, and within minutes had it working again. There was a boyish grin on his face when he stood up brushing dirt from his hands like he'd just solved a major problem. I laughed genuinely for the first time in weeks. "Not so hard," he teased. "Easy for you to say," I replied, brushing a bit of dirt off my knees. That exchange could have ended there. But it didn't. In the days that followed, I started to notice him more. Or maybe I allowed myself to notice. He was always outside tending to his dad's yard running with their old dog, or sitting with a book pencil in hand sketching something in the margins. He'd wave when he saw me. Sometimes he'd stop to chat. Not long conversations. Not at first, just small talk that somehow still felt meaningful. And when he called me Clara instead of Mrs. Owens, it made me feel younger. Like I'd stepped outside the rigid identity of wife and mom and returned even for a moment to myself. I told myself it was innocent, neighborly. But something inside me buzzed after each interaction, like a part of me that had long gone quiet was stirring again. One afternoon in late August, he approached the porch holding a folder. "Mind if I pick your brain?" I looked up from my book, surprised. "I'm applying to grad schools," he explained. "I remember you used to teach. English, right? I'd love your thoughts on my personal statement." I invited him to sit. We spent an hour going over it. I pointed out places to tighten the writing questions that might help him dig deeper. He listened carefully, nodding, asking for clarification. When we finished, he leaned back and said, "You should still be doing this, Clara. Teaching. You light up when you talk about it." I was stunned. No one had said something like that to me in years. "It's been too long," I said quietly. He smiled. "You'd be great." That's obvious. It wasn't just the words, it was the way he looked at me when he said them. Like I mattered. That night I stayed up late thinking about his essay, about the way he listened, about how present he was. Daniel had texted me from his hotel flight landed. Back tomorrow. No call, no warmth, just a status update. Like always. It wasn't a comparison, not at first. But once you start noticing the gaps in one connection, it becomes hard to ignore how another fills them. In the following weeks, Aiden and I fell into a rhythm. He'd bring over books he thought I'd like, share articles he'd read, ask my opinion on everything from politics to poetry. He remembered the details I shared. He asked how I was really doing. It became a part of my day I looked forward to more than I was willing to admit. One day he caught me coming back from the grocery store struggling with bags. "Let me," he said, taking them from my hands like it was second nature. "You always carry too much alone." That sentence sat with me longer than it should have, because it was true, in every sense of the word. One evening, we sat in the backyard while the kids were at a sleepover. Daniel was in Miami. I was drinking iced tea, and Aiden, as usual, had found an excuse to wander over. "You seem lonely sometimes," he said softly. I didn't deny it. I couldn't. "Sometimes, yes." He nodded. "You deserve more than being someone's background character." The words hit like a stone to the chest. That night, I stood in front of the mirror and barely recognized myself, not because I had changed physically, but because I saw myself for the first time in what felt like years. The woman staring back at me wasn't just tired, she was disappearing. I tried to course correct. I spent more time trying to engage with Daniel. I planned a dinner, just the two of us, lit candles, cooked his favorite meal. He was late. When he finally arrived, he barely touched the food and spent most of the time scrolling on his phone. I asked him, "Do you ever feel like we're just existing?" He glanced up, annoyed. "Where is this coming from?" "I miss us," I said. He sighed. "Clara, not tonight. I'm exhausted. Can we not do this right now?" And just like that, I felt the door between us slam shut again. But the one between me and Aiden, it stayed open. We never kissed, never touched beyond the occasional brush of fingers when handing over a book or pruning shears. But there were looks, lingering silences, words that held more than their face value. The day he brought over the novel we talked about, and the note inside it undid me. For when the world gets too loud, you deserve quiet. I sat on the couch with the book in my lap for over an hour. No music, no distractions. Just me, the silence, and the terrifying realization that I had crossed a line internally, even if I hadn't physically. Daniel didn't notice the shift. He didn't notice anything. And Aiden did. That's what made it dangerous. One night, as the sky turned soft and lavender, I walked out to the fence and saw Aiden sitting on his porch sketching. He looked up. "Hey, stranger." I smiled. "Hi." He stood. "Want a walk?" We did, around the block, nothing dramatic. But when he said, "I see you," it stopped me cold. Because it wasn't just a compliment. It was a truth I hadn't felt in years. And I wanted to cry. Not because I was in love, not because I wanted to run away, but because that moment made me realize how deeply invisible I had become to the man I shared a home with. I didn't act on it, but I wanted to. That's the part no one talks about in these stories. The almost, the what if, the emotional affair that hangs in the air, unspoken but undeniable. What I had with Aiden never turned physical, but it was infidelity. Not of the body, but of the heart. I began journaling again, writing out the truth in pages I could fold shut and hide. I wrote about the ache, the hope, the shame. I didn't want him, but I did, and still I pulled away. I told Aiden I needed space. He respected it. He didn't push. But when I saw him walking his dog beneath the streetlights and our eyes met across the yard, everything inside me begged for something different. What I felt was real, but so was the life I had already built. And I was standing at the intersection between what I wanted and what I had promised. There's a loneliness that lives inside a marriage long before it ever gets a name. It creeps in through the cracks of routine settles, in the silence between exhausted conversations, and disguises itself as normalcy. I hadn't realized how deeply it had rooted itself in mine until I saw what connection looked like again in someone else's eyes. I tried to pull back from Aiden to build a wall between us made of polite distance and safe smiles. But emotional gravity is stubborn. The more I avoided him, the more I felt his absence, an absence that grew louder with every dinner Daniel spent glued to his phone, every night he slept in the guest room, every time I whispered good night to the ceiling instead of my husband's back. Still, I didn't reach out, but Aiden did. One afternoon, I found a book on my porch. No knock, no message. Just a novel we'd discussed weeks earlier, left carefully beside the welcome mat. Inside, tucked between pages, was a note, "For when the world gets too loud, you deserve quiet." A. I stood there holding it, unable to move, the warmth of his words pulsing in my palm like something alive. That night, Daniel was late again. I had already put the kids to bed and cleaned the kitchen. I sat on the couch with the book in my lap, staring at the ink heart pounding, and knew I couldn't keep pretending. I was slipping slowly, quietly into something dangerous, and I didn't know how to stop. The next morning, I left the book on my nightstand and started journaling again. I wrote like I was trying to outrun something, filling page after page with the things I couldn't say out loud. I wrote about Aiden's voice, the way it lingered in my head. I wrote about Daniel, how he seemed farther away every day. I wrote about myself, about the woman I had been and the stranger I was becoming. And slowly through the ink, I admitted it, I was emotionally attached to a man who was not my husband. I hadn't physically cheated, but every feeling, every thought I buried deeper than the last was proof enough that I had stepped outside the boundaries of my marriage, and it tore me apart. One Friday, with the kids gone for a sleepover at my parents', I cooked dinner. Daniel walked in late again, mumbling apologies about meetings and traffic. I barely heard him. I watched him eat in silence, the sound of his fork scraping the plate louder than anything he'd said to me all week. After dinner, I turned to him and said, "Do you ever feel like we're just existing?" He looked up, blinking like I had spoken in another language. "What I mean, like we're roommates. Or business partners, just getting things done, not really living together." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Clara, I'm tired. Can we not do this right now?" Then when I asked, "We don't talk, Daniel. We don't touch. We don't even see each other anymore." "I'm doing my best," he muttered. "You act like I don't care." "No," I said, voice trembling. "You act like I'm furniture." He stood pacing. "What do you want me to do? Quit my job? Sit on the porch all day with you?" I didn't respond. I just looked at him and for the first time saw the man he had become. Overworked, distant, resentful, and unwilling to fight for what we used to be. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I simply turned away and slept on my side of the bed, staring at the shadows dancing on the wall. And in the morning I saw Aiden walking his dog under the gray light of dawn. Our eyes met across the yards. My heart leapt and then sank, because I knew I had to choose. I couldn't float in between anymore. That Sunday I wrote Aiden a letter. Not a love letter. Not a confession. A goodbye. I told him the truth, that what we had, though unspoken, was real. That I felt things I hadn't felt in years. That I appreciated him more than he could know, but that I needed to find myself again outside of any man. I sealed the letter and knocked on his door just before dinner. He opened it, surprised. I handed him the envelope. "Please read it later," I said gently. "I need space to rebuild myself." He didn't argue, didn't ask questions. He just nodded, his eyes soft. And I walked away. That night, Daniel and I sat at the kitchen table while the kids played upstairs. "I need to talk to you," I said. He looked up, guarded. "I've been unhappy," I told him. "For a long time." His shoulders dropped. "I know." There was silence. Then I added, "There's someone who made me feel seen again." His eyes narrowed. "Did you—" "No," I said quickly. Nothing happened. But I let myself get close. Too close. He didn't speak. He just stared at the wood grain on the table like it could somehow absorb his anger. "I'm not saying I want to leave," I said, "but I am saying I can't stay like this." He leaned back slowly. "So what do we do?" "I think we start over. Or we let go, but we stop pretending." The days that followed weren't easy. We didn't suddenly become passionate again. There were still cold silences, awkward dinners, and unspoken blame. But there was also something else effort. Daniel started showing up. Small things, making coffee, asking about my day, turning off his phone when we watched a movie. He wasn't perfect, neither was I, but for the first time in a long time we were trying. And as for Aiden, I saw him occasionally across the fence walking his dog or reading in the sun. We never spoke again, but there was no anger in his face, just understanding, and maybe even a little pride. He had given me something I hadn't realized I was starving for reflection. He held up a mirror, and when I looked into it, I saw not the version of myself I had become, but the version I still had the chance to rediscover. I started teaching part-time again, just a few classes at the community center, but it was enough. Enough to remember that I had value outside of motherhood, outside of marriage, that I had a voice worth hearing. Daniel and I began therapy, real therapy. Not just patchwork talks after arguments. It was hard, vulnerable, sometimes painful, but it forced us to tell the truth. I told him I missed being his person. He told me he didn't know how to be mine anymore. But we both agreed we wanted to try. Not to go back, but to build forward. And slowly we did. We found new things to share, new rituals, new laughter. And in the quiet, I learned to forgive myself. Not for loving someone else, but for losing myself in the first place. Healing doesn't arrive all at once. It doesn't knock on the door and walk in with a suitcase full of answers. It trickles in hesitant, fragile, often uninvited. And it asks you to choose it every single day, even on the days when you're not sure it's working. Daniel and I weren't magically better after that first conversation at the table. In many ways, we were strangers, reacquainting ourselves with the ruins of a shared life. There was damage, mistrust, deep fatigue. But there was also a thread, a thin, frayed one that neither of us wanted to cut. Therapy became our neutral ground. We sat on that soft beige couch once a week, trading glances across the room, while a third party, our therapist Camille, asked us questions we had been avoiding for years. What brought you to this point? What does connection mean to each of you? When was the last time you felt truly seen in this relationship? Sometimes we'd both sit in silence, staring down at the rug. Sometimes one of us would speak, while the other listened with arms folded, unsure whether to believe what they were hearing. And other times we cried. There were no grand apologies, just slow confessions. Daniel admitted he hadn't realized how far I'd drifted. I admitted that I hadn't known how to ask for help without sounding like I was blaming him. He said he thought I was just tired, that all moms felt invisible sometimes. I told him I wasn't tired, I was vanishing. In those sessions, we pulled apart the quiet grief we'd both been living with, the resentment of two people who sacrificed different pieces of themselves and never properly acknowledged what it cost. Meanwhile, outside of those walls, life continued in small motions. The kids still needed rides and lunch money and homework help. The laundry still piled up. Bills still came. But the difference now was subtle. Daniel began to lean in instead of pulling away. He sat with me during dinner. He asked about my classes. He looked me in the eye when I spoke, and that alone felt like a victory. I still thought about Aiden, though not with longing, more with clarity. His role in my life had served a purpose. He showed me what it felt like to be noticed, yes, but more than that, he reminded me that I had needs, desires, dreams that hadn't vanished just because I'd chosen to raise a family. In his absence, I didn't collapse. I rose. I picked up my journal each morning and wrote down 3 truths about myself without including the words wife or mother. Some days those truths were small. I am learning to forgive. I am allowed to be angry. I matter. And gradually I believed them. One afternoon, as autumn settled into the trees, I was working in the yard when Daniel came outside with 2 mugs of coffee. He handed me one without a word, just a half smile. We sat on the steps together, watching Laya kick a soccer ball across the yard. "She's getting fast," he said. "She gets that from me." He chuckled softly, then turned to me. "You've changed," he said. I stiffened. "Is that a bad thing?" "No," he replied, shaking his head. "It's just, I think I forgot who you were, and now I'm meeting her again." That caught me off guard. We sat in the silence of that honesty, letting it settle. Later that week, I passed by Aiden's house on my way home from the store. He was on the porch, headphones on, sketching in his notebook just like before. He looked up and gave me a nod. I returned it with a soft smile. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. There was no bitterness, no lingering tension, just the acknowledgement of a chapter closed with care. In the months that followed, Daniel and I rebuilt slowly. Not everything was perfect, and I didn't expect it to be. But the difference now was choice. We weren't just together, we were choosing to be. He started waking up earlier to make the kids breakfast. He joined me for walks in the evening, no phone in hand, no distractions. He asked questions, not just about logistics, but about feelings, about me. I saw him soften, and I allowed myself to soften too. One night after the kids went to bed, I found him in the kitchen washing dishes. I leaned against the doorway and watched him for a while. When he turned around, I asked, "Do you ever think about when we first met?" He smiled, drying his hands. "Yeah, all the time. You were sitting under that tree on campus reading a book way too heavy for a freshman. You made fun of me." "I did. Then you made me read it. And I fell asleep halfway through." I laughed. So did he. And in that moment, I saw him, the boy who once made my stomach flip. The man I married, not because he was perfect, but because he made me feel like home. That man was still there. I just had to dig through the years to find him again. At our next therapy session, Camille asked us, "What does love look like to you now?" Daniel thought for a moment, then said, "Love looks like showing up when it's not convenient." I added, "Love is noticing when someone is disappearing and choosing to pull them back." We both looked at each other then, and I felt it. That spark. Not the wild, reckless fire of youth, but the slow, steady burn of effort, of intention. Aiden wasn't in my story anymore, but what he had sparked in me remained a deeper awareness of my worth, my voice, my limits. He had been a mirror. And through him, I'd learned that wanting more didn't make me selfish. It made me human. Eventually, Daniel and I took a weekend away, just the two of us. No emails, no kids, no agendas. We stayed in a cabin by the lake, drank wine on the porch, and sat in silence that felt healing instead of hollow. We talked about everything, about how close we came to losing each other, about how easy it is to fall asleep in a marriage and wake up years later, not recognizing your life. And most importantly, about how we didn't want to go back to that place, not ever again. We created new rituals, Sunday coffee dates, monthly therapy check-ins, random texts in the middle of the day just to say, "Thinking of you." It wasn't flashy, it wasn't dramatic, it was real, and real was enough. On the anniversary of our first date, Daniel gave me a journal. Inside, he had written a single sentence, "I see you now." I cried when I read it, not because it was poetic, but because it was true. I see me now, too. Not just as Clara the mother, not just as Clara the wife, but as Clara, the woman who once lost herself in the silence, but found her way back by listening to the ache and choosing something louder. I used to think the scariest part of a marriage falling apart was the moment it actually broke. But the truth is, what's far more frightening is when you don't even realize it's happening. When the kisses grow colder, the glances shorter, and you find yourself having full conversations in your head because the real ones feel too heavy. That's where I was, stuck in a silent unraveling. And I might have stayed there if someone hadn't seen me. Aiden never touched me. He never said anything he shouldn't have. But he noticed me. He reminded me of the woman I used to be before the title wife began erasing her name, and for that, I'm grateful. Not because we ended up together, we didn't, but because through him I remembered who I was. I found my reflection again in his kindness, his presence, his honesty. But the real healing came later. It came when I sat across from my husband and we finally looked at each other, not with blame, but with broken honesty. We didn't try to sweep things under the rug. We didn't pretend we hadn't hurt each other. We stayed. We rebuilt. And in the process, I chose something bigger than a moment of escape. I chose growth. I chose to reclaim myself not through the eyes of another man, but by standing in the quiet wreckage of my life and saying I deserve more. And I'm willing to fight for it. To anyone listening right now, maybe you're there too. Maybe you're feeling unseen, unheard, unheld in your own home. Maybe you're standing at the edge of something you're afraid to name. Let me say this to you. You're not crazy for wanting more. You're not selfish for needing to be noticed. And no matter how far you think you've drifted, there is a way back. But it starts with honesty with yourself first, and then with those around you. You are not invisible. You are not too late. You are worth the effort it takes to rediscover who you are and to be loved for her. If this story resonated with you, if you found a piece of yourself inside these words, please consider subscribing. We're not just telling stories. We're telling your stories. The quiet ones, the complicated ones, the true ones. And we want you with us. Drop a comment below. Have you ever felt emotionally disconnected in your own relationship? Let's talk about it because healing starts when we stop hiding. Don't forget to like this video if it moved you. Your support helps us continue creating powerful stories that speak to the heart. And above all, thank you for listening, for being here. Until next time, take care of your heart and never stop fighting for the version of yourself that refuses to disappear.